everyone. Happy Colorado Pollinator Month, as officially designated by Governor Polis at our request. And welcome to PPAN's June webinar, Planting for Pollinators with Kate Hogan and Skyler Smith. Thank you so much again for joining us today. My name is Anna Gray Anderson, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator for People and Pollinators Action Network. For those of you who aren't familiar with our webinar series, we usually hold one each month with a diverse variety of speakers and topics. So be sure to sign up for our e-news and check out our events calendar to keep up to date with all of these upcoming webinars. We've really got a great presentation prepared for you. But first, just wanted to tell you a little bit about us. So we are People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN, the host of this webinar. We focus a lot on making Colorado a safe haven for all who live here, from people to pollinators. We do this through grassroots advocacy, education, and outreach, kind of like this webinar. We also do a lot of policy, community mobilization, and habitat creation work. A good example of that would be our Habitat Fund, which is a small grants program that's based on the sales of the pollinator license plate. And that small grants program goes towards creating pollinator-safe spaces while promoting community mobilization. And there really are a lot of reasons to do this work, but one of my favorite facts about pollinators is that increasing floral diversity, and particularly native plants, and habitat connectivity can help mitigate the effects of urbanization and support pollinator communities in urban and suburban areas. I also would like to invite you to the Big Day of Bugs tomorrow. This will be at the Denver Botanical Gardens from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. and we'll learn more about the importance of pollinators and what you can do to support pollinator habitats, health, and biodiversity. There will also be the Denver Native Plant Swap on the 22nd from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. at Earthlinks. And all gardening levels are sure to find some treasure at this free event where the community really makes it happen. Today, we are so lucky and grateful to have two experts with us, Kate Hogan from Denver Audubon and Skyler Smith from Denver Parks and Recreation. Kate Hogan has worked in the field of environmental education for over 20 years. She holds a BS degree in natural science and biology from the University of Puget Sound and an MS degree in nonprofit management from Regis University. For the last 8 years, Kate has worked at Denver Audubon as the community outreach manager, where she creates strategic partnerships that help fulfill the organization's mission to inspire actions to protect birds, other wildlife, and their habitats through education, conservation, and research. She presents outreach programs through the Denver metro area and manages the Kingery Nature Center at Chatfield State Park, providing public programs and events for visitors who desire a deeper connection to nature. And as an ecological horticulturist for Denver Parks and Recreation, Skyler Smith maintains gardens and landscapes within the parks of the Washington Park Sub-District. He also oversees the design, planting, and maintenance of the high-profile Big Garden, which contains 49 beds and 2.5 acres. He cares for the space and interacts with the many daily visitors and neighborhood members to keep them informed and invested in the gardens. Skyler also works to restore prairie plant communities on abandoned oil and gas wells in the central United States. Once those wells are plugged, he and his team work to repair diverse pollinator habitat on these degraded sites. As we learn about creating a successful and supportive habitat for pollinators, there are kind of three main things to keep in mind. So first, a biodiverse habitat with a diversity of native plant species and a variety of bloom times is vital. Second, pollinator health is supported when we use organic management practices. And finally, considering nesting sites, water sources, and shelter will help pollinators thrive. Kate and Skyler will both expand on these essential items and more. And before we get started, and as a reminder, please stay muted, leave your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, time permitting. We also encourage you to make a donation today so that PPAN can continue to host this free webinar series, and these donations will support our education, advocacy, and habitat creation efforts this year. A donation of any size really does make a difference, so thank you for your consideration. I can also put a link in the chat to make it easy for people. And now I will pass it over to Joyce to share the video on how we'll be going on the ground into the big gardens at Wash Park with Skyler. And don't worry, he is here for a live Q&A portion after the video.
Hey everybody, my name is Skyler Smith. I'm the horticulturist here at the Big Gardens at Wash Park. It's about 3 acres, 50 beds worth of plants. Used to actually all be annuals, and we've been working over the last like 7 to 9 years to transition it to perennials. And my focus over the last 3 seasons has been mostly native perennials. We're really trying to create like a dense, functional habitat for pollinators and birds. I'm an ecologist by training, but have always been really into gardening and urban ecology. So this has been a really amazing experience to work with our volunteers and community members here to create something really special. It's been a big push all through Denver to add more native local plants here to support our pollinators, to use a lot less water. That's been a big push just in general as our climate's been drying out and heating up. So that's why we've been changing this whole area, and it's been really exciting to see the results. Still very much a work in progress, but I'm excited to show you guys what we've been doing around here. The thing, really an issue in all gardens is weed suppression, taking care of weeds. And in native plantings, it can be especially difficult because when you're starting with young plants, especially natives that don't really look like much and take a while to get established, it can be really daunting to decide what's a weed, what's a native plant. So I always encourage people to help in gardens like this, to volunteer. It's a great way to learn and start to discern. So in this bed, we've got kind of an example of traditional horticulture, tons of bare soil. This used to all just be roses, but we've been filling it in with more perennials. I'll show you guys examples of some beds that are farther along later. But because there's all this bare soil, we have tons of issues with weeds. So we've been clearing out weeds here, a lot of thistles and prickly lettuce down here. You can see there's some prickly lettuce that we haven't quite gotten to yet. But in between all these roses is just tons of bare soil. And that bare soil is just an open invitation for weeds. So I'll show you guys, like I said, later on, some examples of beds that we've filled in really densely. And that really sets you up to not have to do so much weeding. But what I'm going to do now that we've cleared out the weeds is I'm just going to do a really shallow top dressing with a compost through here. That's a really great way to suppress those annual weeds. Perennials will grow right up through it, but most annual weeds really don't want to germinate when they're buried under an inch or two of compost. So that's a really great way, once you've cleared an area out, to ensure that you're not just going to have constant annual weeds, because there's just billions and billions of seeds in this soil just waiting to explode. So we're just going to bury them under that. And then we're going to go through either with seeds or with perennials that I'll pick up from the greenhouse and just fill this in. And that's going to help suppress the weeds even more, because as we like to say, plants are the best mulch. When you cover it up with plants, there really aren't that many germination sites for weeds. Okay, so here's the next step in the process. This was really weedy, and it was also filled with this goldenrod. This is a Canada goldenrod. It's a nice native species, but it really reseeds like crazy when there's bare soil, much like a lot of these plants do. So we cleared all of this out, cleared out a lot of the weeds, then covered it in mulch, and we planted all of these kind of young perennial plants. We've got some asters in here. This is an Amsonia. It's a really great pollinator plant. We've got coneflowers. That's Indian grass, nice native grass that will really fill in. We've already got some butterfly milkweed that have been in here, liatrices. But we like to plant pretty densely, about a foot or less in between plants, so that when they spread, all their canopies will touch. and then you're really not going to have much space in there for weeds to grow. You're going to need to weed it while they're young. You want to go through and keep it clean while the plants are small, but eventually they're all going to touch and you're not going to have to worry about it so much. So let's go take a look at what we did last year that's already filled in. Okay, so here's the planting we did last year. This bed used to be pretty much completely bare soil. There's a few roses in here. There are a few really tall grasses, and they used to just plant this with annuals. So it was just a ton of bare soil, not really much else. It really had a tendency to fill in with weeds, and it was just a lot of work. So what we did, we cleared it all out, got it so that it was completely bare soil. Then we planted, I think something like 1,000 plants in here, a bunch of little plugs, like I said, like 8 to 10 inches between them, really dense. And then we mulched with compost over that. So about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of compost top dressing. Then I went in and seeded a grass mix. I used native grasses. I used Cytoxgrama, little blue stem, big blue stem, Indian grass. I've got prairie drop seed in here, and on the edges, blue grama. So a really great mix of native grasses in there, and they helped fill in the gaps in between the plants. So now what you've got is basically complete canopy cover, more or less no bare soil. There's little patches in there where the plants haven't quite gotten big enough, but there's hardly any weeds in here. Occasionally I'll scout through and look for things like bindweed, make sure no thistles have germinated, but I don't really have to weed this bed much anymore. And it's going to explode this year with color. Really excited about it. We've got, I think, something like 30 different native plants in this bed, and really excited to see how it turns out. But there's a lot less maintenance than those rose beds that we have to weed just constantly. So this is the end goal for pretty much all of our beds. Before we move on, I wanted to say one more thing about this bed. Last year, when we planted it with all the tiny little native plants, they didn't really look like much. And we wanted to show people that this was going to be a colorful, showy garden with some intention behind it. So what we did when I seeded in all of these native grasses was I also seeded in a lot of native annuals. So I seeded in some Coreopsis tinctora, clasping coneflower, cosmos, yellow prairie coneflower, the Retibita, and a few others that I knew would bloom that season and give us some color so that it was showy and people could tell that it wasn't just weeds. Because, you know, when you plant native plants and they're young and you've got grasses sprouting in there, people might think that it's not being maintained. And in your yard, that might not be a big deal, especially if it's your backyard. But in your front yard, you probably want your neighbors and your community to know that you're taking care of it, so you don't have people complaining to you. And in a park, we definitely want that. So we like to show that we're taking care of it, that it's not just, you know, going wild or getting weedy. So I put in all those flowers last year. A few of them will probably come back this year, but just like with weeds, those annuals are going to have fewer and fewer germination sites as these native perennials fill in. So they're going to fade away after just a few seasons and you won't see them anymore, but they'll be taken over by all of these great perennials. Okay, here's another bed that used to be a lot of bare soil with some plants in the middle. This Baptisia, the wild blue angel, has been in here for a while, was pretty established, but everything around it was really just Canada thistle and a lot of annual weeds. Everyone in gardens really fears things like Canada thistle and bindweed. They tell you the only way to get rid of it is to spray it, that if you pick it, 3 more will grow in their place. And that might be true for a while, but that's just not how plants really work. If you pick them, you're eventually going to deplete those sugar resources in their roots, and you will get rid of them if you're really diligent about it. So in this bed, I just picked that Canada thistle until I hardly saw it anymore. And while I was doing that, I planted a lot of great native perennials in here. I seeded in this blue grama, that's our Colorado state grass. It's filling in a lot of bare soil, creating a really beautiful texture in here, and preventing those weeds from coming back. While I was at it in this bed, I added a ton of native plants. One thing we really want to do when we're creating native pollinator habitat is add a ton of diversity. So we've got paintbrush in here. We've got some penstemon, that's scarlet bugler penstemon. We've got butterfly milkweed. We've got Retibita, the yellow prairie coneflower, bee balm. Farther in, we've got Indian grass, a few other penstemon species. I planted a sumac, the staghorn sumac in the middle to add some shrub texture to it. So now what we've got instead of the Canada thistle is a really diverse native planting. It's not totally zero maintenance, but it's a lot less weeding than it was before. I just go through and scout and look for those weeds. It's really, really hard to permanently get rid of Canada thistle, but what you can do is establish something like this that's really dense, and then you'll just have very rare thistle. There's one that was hiding in here, and I'll just get it, and that's the only one in this bed now. So a few other sustainable weed management techniques are sheet mulching. I do a lot of that in here. I'll just bury an area. If it's like 100% weeds and it's something like bindweed or quack grass, we've got a lot of quack grass growing in here. It spreads through underground stems. They're called rhizomes, and it will just spread and take over a planting. So when you see that, it's a good one to recognize and a good one to just nip in the bud. And sheet mulching can work really well for it. So something that I did here was I buried it in cardboard, and then I used all of our cutbacks from this late spring. We did that in mid to late April. Cut back and just laid the stems over it really thickly. That way, any pollinators that were in the stems can still emerge when it's time to do it. And it's also helping to smother that. So it's a bit of a mix of a compost pile and our cutbacks. That way, we're still leaving that material here on site for the pollinators to emerge, but it's burying a lot of the quackgrass and bindweed that was in here. And over on this side, we had a really similar situation, ton of quackgrass, a lot of bindweed. I actually dug all of this out. I couldn't probably quite get all of the bindweed roots that are like 3 or 4 feet down, but I dug that far, got all of it out, and then mounded the soil on top of it to make it even deeper over those roots. Then I covered it in even more compost, covered it in straw and twigs, and then seeded it with a native prairie mix. So it doesn't look like much yet, but there are thousands of little prairie plants germinating in there. And it's very exciting. It's going to be a really dense planting. Probably by next year, it'll really fill in and give some great color and pollinator habitat that replace the quackgrass and bindweed that used to be there. I actually haven't seen any bindweed or quackgrass pop up through this except on the very edges. So I'll just keep on top of that, pick it whenever I see it, and make sure it doesn't spread into the planting and take it over. And here's another example of farther along in the process of filling in the rose beds. Over on the other side, I was showing you where it was pretty much just roses at this point, a lot of bare soil, really no competition for the weeds. So they just fill in all that bare space because that's what they do. But over here, we started this one last year. We weeded everything out, composted it, planted a ton of native perennials. We've got a lot of echinacea in here. We've got fleabane daisy that's just starting to bloom over there. Yellow prairie coneflower, verbena, yarrow, some grasses filling in the space. And this side is a lot less weedy than the other side. One of the reasons that that is because we already mulched this one with compost. So that buried a lot of the annual weed seeds. There's still a few of them that come up through it. Got some sow thistle, a little bit of purslane here, but it's really not that much. It'll be pretty manageable. We also seeded it in with some of those native annuals. That's Coreopsis. That'll give it some color this year. The echinaceas will definitely bloom this year in their second season, but we really want to make sure it's really colorful. The roses are still here. People will still enjoy those. But as we all know, Japanese beetles tend to kill the roses during the middle of the summer. They look nice now, but in a few weeks, they're not going to. But the Japanese beetles don't bother the echinaceas or the asters, the coneflowers. So we're still going to have a lot of color in here. That diversity, that competition, it really provides a ton of benefits. It's giving us season-long color. It's distracting from the dead roses in the middle of the summer. But it's also filling in a lot of that bare soil, creating a lot more competition for space that would just be taken in by weeds. So this bed, it's really exciting. It looks a lot different than it did last year. Another thing that we like to do when we are creating habitat in these gardens is to think about how the pollinators live their life cycles. So some of our native bees are digger bees. They really like to have some bare soil, some exposed areas that they can burrow into over winter. Their little nests look kind of like an ant mound, but with a bigger hole in the middle. You might see those in your garden and think that it's ants or something, but a lot of times those are native bigger bees. So in these beds, we did do the top dressing with the compost. A lot of people with native plantings don't like to use compost because our native plants kind of like leaner or mineral soils. They don't really like a lot of compost. And sometimes if they get it, they get huge and leggy and flop all over the place. So to avoid that, people will use things like pea gravel or expanded shale. And that's great for those soils, but that doesn't really create any place for those digger bees to burrow and overwinter, create their nests. So we do, in a lot of our beds, use the compost. It's a bit of a compromise. Kind of a lot of this gardening is about compromising. It's about thinking of how can we manage weeds? How can we create something that our neighbors, our community, in this case, park visitors, will really enjoy looking at, while also creating that habitat and trying to make our jobs a little easier. None of this is going to be zero maintenance, but we're all looking for balance and compromise to try to find the best way to create a beautiful garden habitat that people enjoy while also having those benefits for pollinators.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Skyler. That was really fun to kind of go in on the ground to the gardens and see what you've been up to. So thank you so much. If you want to add anything live, we welcome that. And then we also have a few questions in the chat.
Yeah, of course. It was really fun to share all that with you guys. Hopefully some of that was new or helpful. I really only have about maybe 10 minutes for Q&A, so I'll probably just jump to that part. And then I've got to take off and get back to work. But yeah, feel free. I saw a lot of questions coming in the chat. Maybe Anna Gray, you could maybe read some of those to me. I'm on my phone, so the chat function is not as easy to use.
I could definitely read some out to you. And if anyone else has any questions, please put them in the chat. Our first question is it best to plant perennials in the spring or fall? And how would that affect planting by seed or by plant plug?
Yeah, so that really varies by the species that you're trying to plant. I actually plant pretty much all through the summer just because I get a lot of plants throughout the season and just do what I can to get them in the ground as quick as I can. I would prefer spring. Most perennials really do kind of want to go in the ground in April. And then if that fails, then maybe fall would be better. But if you've got a chance to irrigate them and take care of them through the summer, that's also fine. If you're planting in like the height of July or August, a lot of them will kind of struggle, but they may pull through. And if you're able to keep them watered that first couple of seasons, then most of it is fine to get planted through the summer. Seeds are really different. A lot of them really want to overwinter. They need that cold stratification in order to germinate. So if you plant like a lot of the legumes, for example, during the summer, they just won't germinate. And the seeds that are still viable might germinate the next year, but they really want to go in the fall so they can have like a freezing and thawing cycle. And then a lot of the grasses are totally fine to plant in the summer. The native, especially warm season grasses like blue grama, big blue stem, little blue stem, you can seed those anytime through, honestly, the beginning of July, and you'll probably be just fine.
Great, thank you. And speaking of grasses, people are wondering where you source your native grass seed mix.
Yeah, so a few different places. If you're in Colorado or really anywhere in the Western US, I really like Western Native Seed. They're based in Colorado. Their website is just Google Western Native Seed, and you'll get that. They're really easy to work with, really pretty affordable. And then I use Prairie Moon Nursery a lot as well. They're based out of Minnesota, but they have all of our prairie grass species. If you're going for flowers or forbs, Prairie Moon has more tall grass stuff, so it needs more water than Colorado would get naturally. So Western Native is a great place to get forbs and wildflowers and things like that if you're in Colorado or a more arid landscape.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, bit of a more of a clarification. So if you have a weedy area, you would first pull the weeds, then cover with compost, and then lay down the native seeds on the compost, correct? And do you cover the seeds with anything?
That also really depends on the seeds that you're putting down. But yes, the order that I usually do it in is clear out all the weeds, especially if it's annual weeds. Clear all of those out, get the roots, so that they won't resprout. Then, if you're planting with plugs or with young perennials, I'll get those planted in at that point, and then top dress around those. Because if you're composting and then planting the plants in, you're bringing up a lot of that weedy soil. There's just tons of weed seed in a lot of old garden soil, and when you stir it back up to the top, you're bringing it up on top of that compost top dressing. So you want to put your plugs in first, then compost top dress around them, just right up to the base. Then you can seed on top of that with a good grass mix if you want to do like a grass matrix in between, or some of those annual wildflower seeds I was mentioning. Most wildflowers are totally fine to just be tossed, just broadcast seeded right on top of the soil. Grasses can be kind of mixed. Some like to be a little deeper, but you'll find all that information on the website wherever you buy the seeds. That they'll have seeding depth. But if I'm doing a really diverse mix, a lot of times what I'll do is mix it with like half sand or gravel and half compost, and stir the seeds in, and then broadcast seed it out. That way I've got a lot of heterogeneity. So some of the seeds will be a little buried, some will be closer to the surface. There'll be gravel in there to add some more germination sites. And then some seeds won't germinate because they're not where they want to be, but plenty of them will. So you'll have enough diversity in there that you'll get most of your species to germinate.
Awesome. We've had a few questions about specific species that you're using, and other types of species to use. And people are wondering if there is a list anywhere of all the plants that are used in the big gardens.
Yeah, I've never actually put together like a comprehensive list, but I should. I've got my seed mix lists, and then I have the most common lists posted on kiosks here. I'd be happy to send those to you so you could send them out to the group.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you so much. And maybe we have time for one more question, if that's okay. And this is, are your gardens irrigated? It seems that you have a mix of plants that like it dry and plants that like more water. So, do you have areas that are zoned for water needs, or just how do you manage your water use overall?
Yeah, so one of the downsides of this garden is that a lot of it's on the same irrigation as the turf. So that's more water than a lot of the drier species do want. So a lot of my zones, I'm planting more tall grass and wetland Colorado species. So areas of microclimates in Colorado where you get a lot more water. But then I do have a couple of areas that are on their own zone. And that's where you'll see more of the dry species, the shortgrass prairie species. And then over the long term, definitely we're looking on getting rid of a lot of the turf in this garden so that we can replace it with more dry native species that need less irrigation. But on the whole, we're definitely watering the garden less than we used to once the beds are established.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. I know you got to run, so we can leave it there, and I'll get that plant list from you, and can send it out to people in the follow-up.
Absolutely. Yeah, great talking with you all.
Thanks so much, Skyler. And now we will pass it over to Kate Hogan from Denver Audubon to talk about hummingbirds and other pollinators.
Hi there. Well, thank you, Skyler. I learned a few things as well, which is awesome. As someone who has kind of I was sort of thrown into managing some native gardens, and I didn't actually have a ton of experience with that. So I've learned a lot in the last 9 years, and I'm hoping that I can share some of the wisdom and the knowledge that I've learned specifically today on sort of the natural history of hummingbirds in the Front Range. It was great that Skyler hit upon a lot of these native bees, butterflies, of course, as we know as well, are pollinators, beetles, ants. There's a ton of different creatures in Colorado that pollinate. But being that I'm with Denver Audubon, I am going to go ahead and talk about hummingbirds of the Front Range today. I know some of you may be joining us from areas not in the Front Range, but most of the species that I'm going to cover today are species that we would find across the state of Colorado. So thank you so much, PPAN, for having us today. Our mission at Denver Audubon is inspiring actions that protect birds, other wildlife, and their habitats through education, conservation, and research. We've been around for 54 years in the Denver metro area. And I often like to just clarify for people that we are separate from National Audubon. So I'm not employed by National Audubon. I partner and collaborate with National Audubon on a number of different initiatives. And the closest National Audubon office is Audubon Rockies up in Fort Collins. I saw we have a couple of Fort Collins people with us here today. And then I also saw some people from Colorado Springs. So you may be closer to Aiken Audubon or Evergreen Audubon or Boulder Audubon. Denver Audubon is the largest independent chapter in Colorado. We are an independent chapter because we are our own separate 501c3 nonprofit, similar to PPAN. And so we are community driven by a lot of local grants and local donors, just like you all joining us from the community today. And then some of the different programs that we offer include birding field trips in the Denver metro area. We do our own half-day workshops, often at our Kingery Nature Center. We have schools that we work with. We have adult trainings like our master birder training and our community naturalist training. And then we have a conservation committee that works on a lot of conservation initiatives specific to the Denver metro area. And then we have a non-game wildlife research grant that's similar to the PPAN grant for the Habitat Fund. We fund a lot of studies specific to non-game wildlife across the state of Colorado. So lots of great things that we're doing. And we're also powered by 130 volunteers. So I am one of 8 staff. So I am one of our full-time staff members, and then we have a couple of part-time seasonal staff as well. But of course, we wouldn't be able to do all the amazing work that we do without our 130 volunteers. And then we also receive funding from the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, if you are familiar with that granting organization in the Denver metro area. So lots of great people supporting all of the work that we do. And then I also wanted to share with you about our Kingery Nature Center and our native plant demonstration gardens that are located at Chatfield State Park. So since Skyler kind of mentioned the Wash Park Gardens, I figured a wonderful invite. Also, if you're looking to do a tour, would be to hit up our Kingery Nature Center at Chatfield. And we are on Chatfield State Park property. Oftentimes we get confused with Denver Botanic Gardens Chatfield Farms, which is also amazing, but we are actually located within the state park property line. So here's the map. If you've ever been to Chatfield State Park, a lot of people get caught at the lake. They go boating, they go stand up paddleboarding, and they don't realize that our Kingery Nature Center is actually at the very southern tip of Chatfield, right before you cross the property line over to Waterton Canyon and Denver Water property. So we're kind of a lovely little hidden gem, I would say. It's a great opportunity to get away from the crowds in the bigger part of the state park. So we've got 4 common species of hummingbird in the Denver metro area, and a lot of these also travel through other parts of Colorado given the season. So I thought I would just talk about them today and then share with you a few plants and then some best practices as well for habitat gardening that will follow along with what Skyler shared. So if you're someone who's looked at birds before, some of these species might look familiar. You are welcome to quiz yourself a little bit here for a second on who all I have pictured. If you're new to pollinator identification or bird identification, then maybe some of these might not be as familiar, but I'm hoping that you'll learn these 4 common species of hummingbird pollinators for Colorado, and it's a great place to start. So we've got our broad-tailed hummingbird here on the top left, our black-chinned hummingbird on the top right. We've got our rufous hummingbird on the bottom left, and then our calliope hummingbird on the bottom right. And then the life cycles of these hummingbird species are a little bit different in terms of how they utilize our native plants in Colorado. So I wanted to share that with you a little bit. Our 2 common migratory nesting species of hummingbirds, so these are the hummingbirds that show up in Colorado in early spring, are our broad-tailed hummingbird and our black-chinned hummingbird. So these are birds that are nesting here in the state, as opposed to birds that are just sort of moving through the state as a part of their migration journey. And so the broad-tailed hummingbird and the black-chinned hummingbird, they often are arriving in mid-April, sometimes early May, given the season. And their females are the ones that are actually creating nests and foraging here in Colorado for the entire season. And then they migrate out of the state in early to late fall. We also have our two common non-breeding migratory species. And so that's our rufous hummingbird and our calliope hummingbirds. So rufous hummingbirds and calliope hummingbirds hit Colorado on their southbound migration journey. And so the timing of this webinar is actually really wonderful because a lot of these birds will start showing up around the first week of July. So here, just in the next 2 weeks, we're expecting to start seeing them. So these are birds that have actually already been up to Canada and parts of Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, and they've nested there, and they are starting their fall migration journey in the middle of July, already headed back down to places in Central and South America. So oftentimes we see the males coming through first because they have started migrating before the females leave with the young to trail behind by a couple of weeks or so. And then when we think about hummingbirds as pollinators, one of the kind of really amazing things about them and their role as pollinators is a lot of our pollinators are localized, incredibly localized. We're talking about a mile, maybe, right? Some of these insect pollinators, they might forage a mile, half a mile, quarter of a mile, or in some cases, only a few hundred yards from where they hatched. And so their purpose is to really help with that local sort of micro ecosystem pollination, as opposed to something like a hummingbird, which is traveling hundreds of miles over the Western United States. And they're helping to transport this genetic material from a lot of these different pollinator plants and a lot of these native plants across state lines, across regions. And so it helps for that sort of long distance pollination and is really critical for them since so many of our insect pollinators do not migrate as far. So when we think about habitats for hummingbirds, there's a few different things to consider. Of course, we want to think about food, water, shelter, and space. And we want to consider all of these different things in the mix. And I'm not really going to delve too deeply into these today, just because we only have a few minutes. But if we were going to really sit and kind of delve deep, we'd want to address all of these different things in our gardens, and not necessarily just for hummingbirds, but of course all pollinators as well, because even bees and even butterflies, a lot of them need water, and as Skyler was sharing, they need space and they need shelter for all of their different habitat needs. So if you really want to help pollinators, it's really important to understand that natural history, their entire life cycle, from laying eggs or having live young, all the way until their migration journey and their adulthood, and really understanding how all of these plants play a key role in supporting them. So just as a reminder, I really get the feeling a lot of you in this webinar probably know what this definition is, but I spend a lot of time clarifying for people what native plants are. So I always like to throw in, especially as a native plant master with CSU Extension and that certification that I received a couple years back, when we're talking about native plants, we're talking about plants that are native to Colorado. And so most of the plants I'm going to mention today are plants that are native to our state. With hummingbirds, you can kind of fudge that a little bit, right? So a lot of our hummingbirds are migrating from Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. And so if you're planting for hummingbirds in an enclosed space in, say, a private garden, incorporating a lot of those plants that are native to other parts of the Western US is great. At a place like Chatfield State Park or even Wash Park, where Skyler and I are working with these larger landscapes, we want to be sometimes even more mindful about planting things that are regionally adapted to Texas, or plants that are native to Texas versus plants that are native to Colorado. So if there's a chance that some of these plants can jump, you kind of want to think about that. And so I really encourage you to kind of learn what are the plants that are native to the state, what are the plants that are native to other parts of the Western US, and that can really help to kind of unfold for you some of the different plant options. So native plants, of course, equal food for hummingbirds, But one of the things that's really, I think, amazing to me about all of our plants across the globe is that each and every plant has a unique chemical compound. They have a unique kind of cocktail mix of chemicals. And that, when we start to look at host plants for things like Lepidoptera, which are our butterflies and our moths, is a critical reason why native plants are so crucial to helping bring back local biodiversity. Because a lot of these insects and birds specialize only in plants that are native to Colorado, plants that are native even to the Western United States, not necessarily plants that are native to the Eastern United States if they're not pollinators that are located there. And so when you look at, say, for example, one penstemon flower, it can be visited by a number of different bumblebee species, possibly 5 different species of moth, 1 hummingbird. There's so many different animals that will utilize that one plant. And so when we think about what plants we're choosing and the fact that every patch of soil is an opportunity, then we really start to think, okay, well, if I put this plant in the ground, it might look beautiful, but we want to think about that bigger sort of ecological mix of how is that plant going to serve all of these different pollinators and birds together. So I'm just going to throw out a few different plant species here for you. And I do have a couple of different lists that I'll send to PPAN that they can share after the webinar today. We have a native plants for birds list that we've created, as well as a native plants for hummingbirds list. It is specific to the Denver metro area since that's where we tend to be. But I also think Colorado Native Plant Society has a lot of great regional plant lists for the entire state of Colorado if you're joining us from somewhere else in the state today. So Blue penstemon, this is actually a picture from my backyard. The reason why I like to share this picture is because not all plants are happy where you put them. And Skyler alluded to this. So this is a great example of a mistake, if you will, that I made. I put this Blue penstemon in and it was super happy for 1 season. And then it disappeared and it didn't come back. And so even in my own garden, trial and error is just a part of the plan. So behind there is actually some bee balm, that's growing, Monarda fistulosa. And that is doing beautifully. Very happy, has spread and filled out my entire garden bed. And so what you don't see today is where that Blue penstemon died. I actually put in some swamp milkweed and also some scarlet bugler penstemon, and those are doing really happy in that place. So I just kind of look at failed plant attempts as an opportunity to look at one of the other 2,500 plants we have in Colorado and do something different. It's a good learning opportunity. So here's that bee balm in full bloom, that Monarda fistulosa. This is a broadtail hummingbird that's on this plant at our Kingery Nature Center. It is called bee balm because I also see a ton of our native bumblebee species that love to come and forage on it. And so we have 23 bumblebee species in Colorado. And this is one of the species that they love to come to, especially right now. It's an early season blooming plant. And then we also have, of course, our Colorado columbine. Interestingly enough, in the wild, a lot of hummingbirds love columbines. In my backyard, they don't seem to care as much for them. There's other plants that I have that they prefer. Don't know why that is, but that's just kind of the name of the game. There must be other things nearby that they would prefer. But a lot of hummingbirds will go after them in a wild setting, especially higher up in the foothills and the montane subalpine habitat. And then we also have orange Indian paintbrush. Orange Indian paintbrush. I was so surprised and really impressed that Skyler was able to get this to germinate in Wash Park. We have tried to put it in at the Kingery Nature Center, and much to our avail, it has not worked. But I do see it in a lot of areas around the Nature Center. And because I think it is a parasitic plant, it's supposed to have companion plants with it. For whatever reason, it's just not doing well. We haven't figured out the magic formula at our Nature Center, but it is a wonderful plant for hummingbirds, and they do love to come and forage off of it. And then this is a late season blooming plant. So this is dotted gay feather. Skyler also mentioned this. He mentioned liatris. So this is one of our liatris species, Liatris punctata. So this is a plant that starts to bloom in late July, early August, when a lot of the plants that are blooming right now will go ahead and bloom and then die off. So it's a great late season plant. as well as this one. So Rocky Mountain Bee Plant is one of our annuals. So we did have it pop up one year in our demonstration gardens, and it was beautiful. And I had tiger swallowtails coming to it, and I had different types of hummingbird moths, like white-lined sphinx, coming to it. And then it just stopped growing in that space. So yeah, we enjoyed it for one season, and we've tried to reseed some more seeds in hopes that we might see it at another time. And then Scarlet Gilia is the last plant that I'll leave you with. So this is a great plant that I've seen blooming as late as like mid to late September. This is a great example of a plant that's only pollinated by hummingbirds. And you can see why, because of the shape of that flower. Some of them can be even more of a beautiful like orange color as well. So not all red, they can be kind of a reddish or a light orange, but they are exclusively pollinated by hummingbirds. And then a couple of things to consider as far as artificial feeders. So I do have a lot of people that ask about this. So I have, I think, a lot of people in the Denver metro area that want to put out hummingbird feeders as a way to help local hummingbirds. And so I try to really encourage them to consider what the ethical considerations of using an artificial feeder might be. They have to be cleaned, they have to be refilled very often. If they sit in the sun for too long, sometimes even like less than a day or two, that can be an issue because, of course, you can get mold. The beaks of the hummingbirds can introduce bacteria. And so if you're someone who's really, I think, motivated and dedicated to stay on top of those artificial feeders, then there's not anything necessarily wrong with using them. But also, if you are in an area that has a ton of black bears, as we are at the Kingery Nature Center, we can't put out artificial hummingbird feeders because black bears are attracted to them. They come and pop the lid off and drink it like a little sweet snack. So there's just some kind of things to consider. And a lot of hummingbirds, of course, love to utilize our native plants. So a native plant garden is a great alternative. And then plant choices play a key role in providing areas for hiding and nesting. So this is a picture also from my backyard. I live in Parker, Colorado. And when I looked at my pollinator habitat in my yard personally, and then our entire landscape around us, what I saw a lot of was a lot of trees, a lot of turf grass, a lot of shrubs. I really didn't see any pollinator plants anywhere in my direct vicinity of my home. And so this is a beautiful aspen tree that my neighbors have growing next to me. And we see hummingbirds perch in the tree all the time. Here's that little hummingbird hiding right in there. And so providing things like trees, like evergreen trees or other types of trees for hummingbirds to perch in and nest in is really critical. But it doesn't mean you have to have one. If your neighbors are utilizing that as an opportunity for hummers and other pollinators, then why not look at some nectar plants and be able to fill in those gaps? And then even hummingbirds have a high reliance on insects. So this is something that I also find a lot in my community outreach efforts. People really underestimate how many different insects hummingbirds consume. So given what study you look at, it's been anywhere from 30 to 80% of their diet is estimated to be insect-based, not nectar-based. And so that's where sugar water is also a wonderful alternative. It might be good in a really desperate situation, especially in the middle of a snowstorm. Like that's a great time to put out a sugar water feeder. But truly, they need to have insects, and those native plants provide those native insects, and then also those native plants provide a lot more wholesome nectar opportunities. And then sweet baby hummingbird females do all the work, which is another reason why having really dense, wonderful habitat for female hummingbirds specifically, especially our broadtails and our black-chins in Colorado, is critical to their success. So the food slurry that they regurgitate for their babies is a combination of both nectar and insects. And the mom will leave her nest sometimes up to 200 times a day because she has no help from the deadbeat dad hummingbirds. So they mate and then they leave her to do all the work. And so if you provide really critical habitat with native plants, a water source, shelter, and space where she can nest, that's going to really help encourage her to feel safe and be able to care for her young and actually fledge both of her babies, and sometimes even 3. It's rare that a female hummingbird will try to fledge 3 babies on her own. But if there's enough food, enough supply for her, she can do it. They're amazing, amazing little creatures. So Skyler talked about this, but I'm just going to kind of go ahead and touch on this one more time. So habitat structure, water, removing invasive plants, eliminating the use of pesticides, if at all possible, removing hazards such as perhaps a cat that roams outdoors, providing opportunities for active stewardship, educating your neighbors, participating in community science and recording the pollinators you're seeing, which was talked about at the beginning of the webinar. And volunteering in other habitat gardens is a really wonderful way to just provide this wholesome habitat hero garden for a lot of our pollinators. So Audubon Rockies has their Habitat Hero certification program. You can also, of course, get a certification through National Wildlife Federation or the Native Plant Society. And so some kind of tips for success, evaluate your neighborhood again as a whole living sort of micro ecosystem. So live by example, pick an area and just get started. Maybe your front yard is a good place to start. Your neighbors walk by it, they see it every day. If they see gorgeous natives, they might ask you, hey, what is that plant? Building a living habitat also takes time, so be patient with yourself, evaluate each year, add different perches, rotate and try different native plants, attend community events and meetings and share your tips with your neighbors, and maybe even use things like your local newsletter or posting on social media, some of the different beautiful pictures of your native plants and the pollinators that are utilizing them. And then just to kind of leave you with this quote, and then we can do some questions. So when the Spanish first encountered hummingbirds, they called them resurrection birds, for surely something the shining and perfect died each night and was reborn the next morning. And so every day we can witness miracles, and each day we can participate in resurrection and in mending the broken world through our local habitat restoration. So thank you so much. I really appreciate having everyone join us today. And Anna Gray, I'll turn it over to you for questions.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was awesome. I think we all learned a lot. We really appreciate it. We do have a few questions. The first one is, do the native Texas and other Western US native plants disrupt our Colorado native plants? And how do you select the best match for Colorado?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I am what they call a native plant purist. And so this is like me personally. The more that I've learned about native plants that are like native to the state of Colorado, that is what I try to prioritize as much as possible. There are some schools of thought out there that because of climate change, we actually might want to consider starting to plant things that are native to New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, because our climate is changing in Colorado, becoming hotter over time. But from what I've seen of a lot of our natives, like that we have planted at our demonstration gardens, they're all still just doing wonderfully, and they thrive in our Colorado environment with little to no maintenance. So unlike Skyler's gardens, our gardens are really not maintained. And a lot of that is because of volunteers and funding and lack of staffing. So we do a lot of just putting things in the ground and seeing what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. So actually our gardens are not irrigated at all at the Kingery Nature Center. They are truly xeric and native rainwater gardens. And so I do think that sometimes moving plants around, even from other parts of the US, could be disruptive given where you are. So sometimes I try to think mindfully about, again, since I'm at a state park, I don't necessarily want to introduce plants from Texas that weren't found there historically. So I'll look at SEI-Net, which is a big botanical database, and I'll actually look to see were some of these native plants documented in the early 1900s in Jefferson County, and that's often how I decide what I'm going to plant in our demonstration garden.
Great, thank you. And like you said, it is kind of fun to just try to plant something and see what happens. Our next question is about the hummingbird feeders, and are raccoons attracted to that nectar?
Absolutely. raccoons are attracted. Other types of insects like wasps, European paper wasps, because a lot of adult wasps, even though they're really good pollinators, it'll also attract them. So there's a lot of wildlife that can be attracted by an artificial hummingbird feeder. So we actually don't put them out at our nature center, and I also don't put them out at my own house. But that's because I have a ton of native plants that they can forage on, and so the need for an artificial feeder is kind of negated because of the diversity of native plants already found.
Got you. Speaking of hummingbirds, what are your kind of top recommendations for the water sources?
So honestly, a lot of hummingbirds specifically won't like come down to a bird bath. So similar to a lot of pollinators, utilizing shallow water sources is really important. So a lot of bees and butterflies can actually drown in bird baths because they're too deep. And so if you want to help pollinators, you want to do shallow water. A lot of hummingbirds, though, because they're drinking nectar, a lot of that moisture will come to them from their food source. So hummingbirds tend to use bird baths most for bathing, and they prefer moving water, something that's bubbling or dripping. And so we don't have a ton of power available to us at our demonstration gardens. And also we've got ponds and we've got the South Platte River. So we don't have anything that has moving water near our nature center, but oftentimes in a backyard setting, that's what they're going to prefer for bathing purposes specifically.
Great, thank you. And we have more of a specific question to urban areas where people have really been trying to attract more hummingbirds, but they're concerned about the inner city and the concrete jungle and the traffic and the power lines and all of that.
Sure.
And so what's kind of a good recommendation for how to attract hummingbirds to urban areas?
Yeah, so if you have been to the Denver Botanic Gardens at York Street, they're a great example of how having anything that is densely planted, even in the middle of an urban center, is beneficial for hummingbirds and pollinators. And a lot of these hummingbirds, when they fly overhead, they're flying, hundreds of yards, kind of like up in the air. And they will come down, and once they find a landscape that they enjoy, they will come back year after year after year. And so I don't worry about the urbanization part of it as much, because especially with a lot of birds, they just in general, not just hummingbirds, but a lot of migratory birds, they're flying over anyway in search of these areas where they can stop over and rest and refuel and nest. And so for actually local insect pollinators, that's a bigger concern for a lot of urban infrastructure, because if they don't have that habitat's been destroyed and they can't travel that far to find where they can have their food resources, it's a big issue. But hummingbirds are really good at being resourceful. A lot of them actually stop in the Denver metro area, but then keep going into the foothills. So, they migrate a ton and they move quickly based on where the habitat is located. So densely planted native plants, providing a tree or other type of habitat for shrubs as well, for these hummingbirds, will continue to attract them even in an urban setting.
Wonderful, thank you. It is 1:02. Do you have time for a few more questions?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, thank you. This one's more specific to native plants. Should you cut back penstemons and blanket flower after blooming? Will they rebloom?
I don't cut anything back. So in our demonstration gardens, we don't cut back a single thing. Similar to what Skyler had mentioned with cutting back some of those plant stems from their demonstration gardens and then setting them down as a mulch. One of the things that I learned from Dr. Adrienne Carper, who does a lot with our Colorado Pollinators Summit Planning Committee, is a lot of these native bees utilize plant stems. And a lot of the native bees, sometimes certain ones are on a 2-year life cycle. And so if you cut back a plant, even like one season in, you may not necessarily be allowing a larva of native bees to develop fully. And so we don't cut anything back. Once it flowers and it blooms, we just leave it. And I've had to train my own garden volunteers to be like really good about not cutting anything back until even like mid-May, because they all get the itch. It gets nice in April and everyone wants to go out and start cutting everything back. And so we leave as much as we can. And like the exception might be is if you have a plant that's like flopping over on a sidewalk or something, you might want to cut that back just so that people can walk by. But as much as you can leave is wonderful, because nature often doesn't prune itself unless there's like a deer or a rabbit that comes to browse, otherwise, or natural, snowfall, things like that. There's not a ton of pruning that nature does on its own.
Got it. Thank you. And then what was that database you mentioned again? I will send that in the follow-up. People are very interested.
Oh yeah. So the database is S as in Sam, EI net, NET.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, so oftentimes I'll enter in the scientific name of the plant, and then you can go and you can hone in and actually see based on county, like where a plant has been documented historically. I feel like maybe Jennifer Ackerfield from Botanic Gardens was the one who told me about that database, or maybe a couple of the other horticulturists at Denver Botanic Gardens. They were the ones who shared that database with me.
Great, thank you. And then we have two final questions. Well, we just got one more, but I think
okay.
we could answer that one too. Do you have any book recommendations for Colorado pollinators and hummingbirds and native plants?
Well, some of my favorite resources aren't books per se. I really love the landscaping guides from the Colorado Native Plant Society. I also really love the databases that National Audubon has created, as well as National Wildlife Federation. And then Xerces Society also has some really wonderful resources on regional, like Rocky Mountain plants that you can plant for like host plants and native bees. And then CFU Native Plant Master Program and a lot of the native plant fact sheets that were created by Barbara Fahey, who was the founder of the Native Plant Master Program. Those resources are all kind of my go-tos. So I like them because they're web pages, they're web-based, as opposed to being an actual hard copy book. And honestly, we don't really have a book that I'm aware of that compiles all those resources. I've just kind of compiled a whole list of resources over the years that I refer back to all the time.
Great, thank you. Yeah, there are so many different resources out there, and it's always good to be checking them. And thanks for all of the ones you mentioned.
Yeah, and I would say natural history for hummingbirds specifically is if you go to allaboutbirds.org. So that is through the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. And so what I like about their website is you can actually look at a profile of, say, a broadtail hummingbird, and you can see every plant and or insect that that bird has been observed consuming over time. So that's a really great comprehensive list for birds specifically.
Great, thank you. And before we get to our final question, I would just love to ask everyone again to please consider donating to PPAN so we can continue to do this webinar. I will put a link in the chat. And then our final question is more about native bee habitat and if they use all stems or just hollow stems.
Oh, great. That's a good question. I am not a native bee expert, so I would not be the best person to ask this question to. I think Lisa Mason from CSU Extension would probably be a really good person to ask because she is the coordinator of the Native Bee Watch program, or Dr. Adrienne Carper. So my understanding is that from kind of what I've seen, a lot of the plants that are going to be utilized are going to be plants that already come with a hollow stem. So something like bee balm, specifically Monarda fistulosa, that's in the mint family, when you cut back that stem, you actually see that there's a nice hollow space that naturally occurs in that plant stem. And I've also seen this in a lot of our native milkweeds, so like swamp milkweed, showy milkweed. And so there's certain plants, of course, that already come with having this hollow space inside of their stem. And so I would think from a native bee perspective, that's probably going to be more of those plants that those native bees are going to utilize, just because that space already naturally occurs in the plant.
Awesome. Thank you so, so much, Kate. And thank you to everyone for joining. I know we're a little bit over time. This video will be posted on YouTube, and we cannot thank you and Skyler enough, and Denver Audubon and Denver Parks and Rec. And I think we all really learned a lot. So thank you so much, and we will be in touch.
Thank you. Go out and plant, everybody. Have a great summer.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.